all of my talks end up being Q&As because with a Q&A, hopefully you're talking about things, you're speaking to matters that people are interested in, rather than rolling out some speech about the decline of the West or something, which may not be what you want to hear. And here we have a question. See how easy it is? Sometimes I've got to go, come on, but we didn't have to. Yes?
This is a divergence from the Henson canon that we're more commonly recognised. Was this project happenstantial, or did you say, I'm going to go to New York and photograph the streets, people on the streets before it disappears, or can you tell us about the gestation of the project?
All right, where did it come from? I've been in New York a lot. I was having my love affair with the empire, the centre of the empire, certainly culturally, and I was in New York a lot through the 80s, and I think Roslyn and Tony were with me. We were at the Guggenheim. That's what we did a show there in the 80s as well. But I was there taking photographs from helicopters and wandering around the streets, LA and New York mainly. And I must have I don't know how many times I went there in the 80s, but I'd go 3, 4, 5 times a year. And it was just that stage in my life when I was fascinated with America, a capital A, and I made a group of pictures in 87, 88 that I put out. Some of them were collages, some of you may have seen some of them. And then really the last year I was there a lot was 1989. I was probably there 3 or 4 or 5 times. And I had, it was everything about it was fascinating, everything about it was intoxicating. People have this sort of thing, you can see it happening with the Germans, like the Germans, you find all these people kind of start making films and they can't get America out of their system, whether it's sort of, this director or that, or people go there and, fall in love with the place, or go there and set up a studio and paint. I suppose it's because it goes back to, it's as old as history, it goes back to Urbi et Orbi, Rome and the rest, Rome and the world. There's a fascination with the centre of the empire, especially, coming from the provinces, as we are. And so it fitted into a very old pattern historically. But I think the strange thing with this group of pictures is that whereas with all of the preceding groups of work, I used to work on the pictures pretty quickly after I'd shot them. I'd go out and I'd shoot. I'd get the film processed at Berkeley KL, which is a 24-hour lab in New York, just so I could see the negs, so I knew what I had, because I had the negs. And then when I got back to Australia, I'd go back to Melbourne, I'd make contact proof sheets, little, 6 rows of 6 frames. And then I'd get out the white Chinograph pencil and I'd just, they could sit around for months and months, but I'd start printing them and, well, that's interesting, that one works, that one works. And so you'd have this ongoing thing in the studio once you'd taken the photograph, where you actually then made the photograph. There's one thing, everyone can take a photograph, but then you've got to make a picture or make a photograph. And it's not a 50-50 thing, but it's an important part of it for me. So in '89, I'd sort of almost run through my, my need to be in America. And after years and years, I'd walk into Bradley's, I'd walk into these jazz bars I used to sort of be in. You'd go out and shoot and then drop the film off at the lab at midnight or 1 and then go to a couple of jazz bars I used to like that were amazingly good. About a third the size of this gallery, with just enough room for a few tables and a piano, whatever. And you'd walk in and the girl would go, gin and tonic, right? Hadn't been there for 3 or 4 months. But so it was it felt like a home away from home. I used to stay in this place called the Algonquin, which is actually where Dorothy Parker and H.L. Mencken started the New Yorker magazine way back. But it was full of all these guys that had probably got the job after the Second World War, and they'd shuffle around in penguin suits and, good morning, Mr. Henson, will you follow me, please? It was sort of a real time capsule. And it didn't occur to me until I, had these pictures in my data safe for decades as contact proofs, which I always used to find and go, oh, gee, I really like these, they're really interesting. I always loved looking at them. But the penny never dropped on how to make the pictures. For me, it's objects, it's the object, it's the print. That's the final expression or the final iteration, the final form that I'm interested in. Some other great photographers, the final form is a magazine essay, or it might be something that even just occurs online now. But for me, it was always the physical, it was making a thing. That's how I think of photography. I make objects that happen to be photographs. That's really how I think about it. And if I could get closer to what I want to do by going back and getting a lump of clay or making something out of wood, I'd do that. High tech, low tech, it doesn't matter. So these pictures were unusual in that they sat in the cylinder boxes in my data safe, and every 10 years I'd be looking for someone to open the box and I'd go, oh gee, I love these. But the penny never dropped on how to make the prints. I loved the picture, I loved the images, and I loved the size of them in the contact proofs. And I used to look at them in the magnifying glass, which I still do, because I still shoot film. And it was only about 2 years ago, I just happened to open this box up, and I just went, I know what to do with these. It's just the penny has dropped. And I think upon reflection, it's as though they needed to become a time capsule for me. They needed to be something which were photographs of a place that no longer exists. They needed to turn into something which was a long way back in my experience. And at that point, the penny dropped. And so it took 35 years or whatever it was from when they were shot to when these prints were made. So the last 2 or 3 years, I just had a ball in my studio making these pictures. I knew it just went, I know how they should look. I know what they should be like tonally. I know what that kind of grain, how it should look. I know because, you know, you've got all the software in the world to use now. Then when I scanned those little 35mm negs, when I scan a 35mm neg, I get about 350 million pixels. That's a lot of pixels. So each little grain, when you go up close, it's probably got 30 or 40 pixels to it. You know, the number crunching is so amazing, and I love it, that you can do things, if you want to waste your time, that are so far below what the human eye can see. There's no real point in doing it. But it's limited only by your imagination, as is everything. When you pick up a brush, when you pick up a hammer and chisel, when you make a photograph, it's only limited by your imagination. And so the weird thing with these was that long gestation period before I just got it. I just opened the box and went, I know what to do after 35 years. And so here they are. They've never been on a wall before. They've never been in a book before, this particular group. And they're all in that new book, but it was a bit of an odd one. And so once I started working on them, I had a ball. I mean, I spent about 2 years, and I just like, I knew what to do with the tones and push it in, pull it out, layers of, I don't know, those of you who are literate with things like Photoshop and other software, but there's kind of surface blur and Gaussian blur, and there's 100 degrees by 100, so you've got 10,000 ways of fiddling with it, way below what you can actually see, especially on a monitor. At a certain point, you have to start making prints, test strips, because even a really good monitor's reflected light is transmitted light, where of course any piece of paper is reflected light, totally different thing. You can only go so far on a monitor or on a screen. So I had a ball, and so I was putting layers of transparent film grain over the top of other layers of transparent film grain, wandering around in these things, and at a certain point that was it. I went through all the hundreds of rolls of film that I'd contact proofed, and the ones that I'd always liked, and they're the ones that ended up on the wall. So that's how it came to be. And it's rather unusual, because normally when you're working on a series, and I've always worked in series, don't know why, it's always a group, it's just the new ones grow out of the old ones. You want to see, the physical kind of form it takes, as you're working with a landscape or a model or whatever, a particular model. You start doing things straight away, and it's important with the human form. It's very important with a model for them to see, if you work with them for years like I do, like 10 years sometimes, for them to see what the two of you are making together. And so it's important to make prints as you go along. But this was a different story. This was a landscape, and of course it's a city that no longer exists. So, is there another question out there? Yes?
Just following on from that last comment about a city that doesn't exist. Clearly 35 years is a long time, but just from today's vantage point, and I don't know when you were there last, but what do you see personally as all these differences from then till now?
Oh, I think that the differences are, they're both externally global, and they are also a part of the inland empire that we all carry around inside us, you know, just as we carry our childhoods around inside us for the rest of our lives. It's part of your life's experience. And so things like nostalgia, which I would never make light of. I mean, if you want to cure yourself and think nostalgia was indulgent, just watch Tarkovsky or some a great Russian director or something. It's not. It's a very powerful thing. It's a very powerful thing that helps form you as you travel through life. But now I think there are kind of technical things which come obviously straight away that you could see with these pictures. There's no LEDs. All of this is fluorescent and neon technology. That's the only light that's there. The street lights are all sodium vapour. I mean, there's no modern technology. There's an ad somewhere in one of these pictures over there for music cassette tapes. You know, so the nature of the technology, both in the you know, basic detail, and in also the way these things feel and how film, which is, you know, film, lots of people use film still as I do now, but the way in which the film registers all of these different light sources and what part of the colour rendering index they occupy is very, very important in working out how you would make it, how you made these pictures and how you might do it now. I was back in New York not so long ago for my godson's wedding, and of course he lives there. He's a commissioning editor for Penguin US. His girlfriend runs T magazine for the New York Times, so they're in the city all the time. And you walk through Times. I just went for a walk through Times Square, and of course it's all Disney. It's all been scrubbed. It's all, you know, blinding LED. Everything is different. You know, not just the shapes of the cars, but along with that is this whole bigger question of the interaction or the collision of technology and the population or society. So where I'd take your question, if I, you know, to things that I think matter, it's the effect of technology overall. Years ago there was a musician, well, she's still around, Laurie Anderson, and she did this sort of very ambitious tour across the United States called United States Live, and it came out as 3 LPs, so that gives you the date of it, you know. It's like David Lynch's Twin Peaks, that came out as an LP too. My, how time speeds up. But she does this one thing with a vocoder which makes her sound like a grumpy old philosopher. Or she's sounding like this, saying, well, in the future the world will be digital, everything will be digital. So digital technology is one of those central things which has changed the way, you know, we have a relationship to the city around us, and which has made these things to me so fascinating and such a kind of a time capsule. The key aspects of digital technology, I think, in relation to, well, you know, mass production and society reflect each other. They're kind of like two mirrors in a room. And what happens with digital technology, mostly in music, in image making and everything else, is that it increases contrast. And the higher, where you look at a Hollywood photograph of, you know, Hedy Lamarr from, you know, the 1930s or 40s, you will see 1,000 shades of grey in that black and white photograph. And that has gone down to 100 shades of grey, and then to 10 shades of black and now it's just black and white. So the amount of information that you actually are able to discern with the human eye, a bit like the colour rendering index, is being compressed. I call it the compression industry, actually, and there's less actual information. So you have like intense colours, brilliance, you know, sharp edges, but the amount of sort of grey in most things, that particularly images, but also music. That's why you hear this endless chat about LPs, even though they're covered in scratches and it's old-fashioned technology, as opposed to CDs, and now as opposed to sort of MP4s or 5s. You know, there's a compression going on the whole time, and the information that you are able to pick up, having evolved over millions of years. Let's say we're a general mammal, give us 50 or 60 million years. There's far less information there. And the way the threads I want to run through this are a whole lot of things to do with the impact of digital technology, which changes the shape and look of the city today. It's a different city. I mean, if you walk through London in the 1880s, you know, it'd be gas lamps and candles, you know. So the technology is the thing that drives it and changes it, but it's also the thing that is, in a funny kind of way, giving us everything and taking everything away. It's a real Damoclean sword. It's always a two-edged sword technology. You know, you build the wheel, then you've got to make the road. And with digital technology, it's particularly complex because it's now all pervasive. It's now a part of our body almost. You know, you've heard of these conversations, everyone's having them, but you know, the mobile phone, the smart screen, the kids in the back of the car watching the back of the driver's seat, all this stuff. I've had interesting conversations with neuroscientists about how the cities have changed and how it is different now to how it was 20 or 30 years ago. And at the centre of it is digital technology. And at the centre of it is technology generally, of course. But people now are, if you like, living in that inland empire much, much more. And so, of course, they all walk past each other and they're all like this. And so the interconnections between everyone and each other's bodies, you know, that sort of Nietzschean thing, the great intelligence of the body, is diminishing. I know at least two neuroscientists, one British woman she's had a couple of great series on the BBC, Susan Greenfield, and her area has been the effect of extended screen time on the young human brain. Started with TV really, and most of that research was done involving behavioural studies, but of course now it's all kind of MRIs and all the rest of it, so you know they can map, you know, electrical activity very accurately. And she said to me once, we were having a birthday party in Melbourne of all places, and she said, what do you think it's led to? And I said, people are getting dumber. And she said, yep, take any one of the 10 dozen standard intelligence tests now. She said, but the physiology is changing. And I said, you're kidding. She said, well, I think I'm going to be proved right. The frontal lobes are starting to shrink in kids. Why is this? It's because they're not experiencing the world, they're not actively engaging with the world with their whole body. They're sitting on their ass, their eyes and ears are taking in almost everything that they do for 10, 12 hours a day. So what they're taking in, of course, is a highly compressed amount of information. A tiny amount of, there it is, there's a picture of a fire burning and there's the sound recording of it. There's no information relative to that going into the body as opposed to being in front of a real fire. So it comes back to things that the philosophers have written about for many, many centuries, and that is the great intelligence of the body. Your whole body is taking in information all the time. A bit of it gets up here where we can consider it intellectualised, whatever you want, but it's going in all the time. Your body's largest organ, your skin, you know. And so all of those fundamental conditions of life on Earth, you know, gravity, velocity, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, all of that stuff is disappearing out of people's lives as they spend longer and longer on a chair, plugged in and looking at a screen. I'm not saying we all should go back to a fake bucolic thing of climbing trees and stuff in the middle of the city, or whatever, digging the veggies out with our claws, but it is having a tremendous effect. And so I think those sorts of conditioning factors, they apply universally to all sentient beings, are what makes the city look different now. What makes the city, or what makes the physical world around us a different place. And so that's the way my mind goes when I go off on a tangent about how is New York different now. It's not so much that it is LED technology, and it's not so much that it was neon and fluorescent. It's that, it's as though you have to look backward because you can learn from the past, but you can't learn from the future. And the best line I've ever seen, with coming out of literature in the 20th century that sums this up, is the L.P. Hartley line from the opening of The Go-Between, that great novel. They made a film out of it. The past is a different country. They do things differently there. And so that's kind of where I go in terms of comparing the past and the present, whether it's New York or anywhere else, of course. You just have to follow the three. I'm sorry. I hope I'm making sense. You can interrupt because hecklers are great. Hecklers are like, hecklers are good for you. They're like fibre in the diet. So you can always interrupt. I mean, I love it. But there was a hand that went up there. Yes.
I just wondered, have you documented...
I might bring this closer because you're a bit... Yeah.
Have you documented other cities you've lived in before in the way you documented this city? Is that your kind of way of being in the world? Aside from the work you compose with an idea for a show or a group work, do you do that? Like, do you live in Europe or somewhere
No,
else?
I've never lived anywhere except in Melbourne, although I did feel like I I spent a lot of time in New York and LA. I just go back and forth 3 or 4 times a year, and that was a big thing for me in the 80s. You know, I had my, as I said, love affair with Rome, so to speak. But no, people sometimes say, so where are you based? You know, I'm not based anywhere, I live in Melbourne. So even the language is kind of crazy with a lot of this stuff these days. And most of my photographs have been made in Melbourne. And when I was going back a few years before this, I used to love this. I always found, I grew up in a suburb, semi-rural, but suburban Melbourne, and I always found it incredibly beautiful. I was always dumbstruck by the beauty of everything around me, which means I was useless. You know, like you'd go to school and get picked last for the cricket team and last for because they're going to put you on the oval at Glenwavy High School and the ball was just going to go straight past because I'm looking at the clouds, you know, really looking at the clouds and then photographing them years later. It's like, oh, look at that, you know. So I spent most of my time at school lying in the long grass of the school oval while they were bashing the hell out of each other, playing football or whatever they were doing. Reading, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. Great biography. I read Penguin. It was 900 pages. Henry Troyat's biography. Tolstoy was almost as good as Tolstoy himself. Anyway, so I just buried myself in books and painted and did my stuff. I think at a certain point, because I always loved the beauty of the landscape, whether it was a suburban landscape, the thing that teenagers are supposed to reject when they get all groovy and, you know, move into a group household, go to uni. I always found it very beautiful, and so I spent years trying to work out how to photograph the suburbs, Australian suburbs. And it's a very important thing because it's the middle class, you know, and this is now, I mean, perhaps not back then in the mid-80s when I started this project, but it's Australia, I believe, is now probably the most middle class country in the world, which is a sign of its deeply civilised conscience. You know, almost everyone can have a reasonable life here. There are a few people at the top who've got a lot of money and a few people at the bottom that need help. But compared to the States or compared to, you know, even Canada and New Zealand, I think it's very middle class. And there's something beautiful about that. So I'm sort of sounding like almost iconoclastic, as if I'm sort of destroying the notion that, you know, the banality and all of the dreariness that, you know, Barry Humphries so brilliantly parodied is actually important, but, you know, it is important. And, you know, I know that Barry was an old friend of mine, so we used to talk about the beauty of the suburbs all the time. He used to say, I'm in London. He said, I'm missing the summer. He said, cracked blue stones, you know, faded paling fences. I can't wait to get out there, you know. So it's the nostalgia again, you see, but real poetry. So I started working on this series of pictures of the suburbs in Melbourne, but once again, it took a while for the penny to drop, and the penny was that this actually isn't a landscape, it's a dreamscape. You know, there's a bit of a throwaway line that Gabrielle Chanel, as in Chanel, used in a letter to Visconti. Some of you may know. Visconti's a great Italian film director, long gone. Died in 76. Died on the 17th of March 1976, Visconti. Very sad. Anyway, and she was writing to him because they were kind of, you know, they hung out a lot in Paris. And she sort of said this thing, which is a little bit dumb, but her heart was in it. She said, you know, it's not the life you live that's important, but it's the life you dream. And at one level, that is great. And so once I realised the suburbs in Melbourne needed to be a dreamscape, I knew how to photograph them. You know, I was able to introduce either the unreality or the deeper reality, which is that it's not so much the prescriptive, the informative, it's the suggestive. That's what makes photography hopefully turn into art. It's not the dumb veracity of, here it is, teacup on a table, there's the proof. Objects in space, events in time, there's the proof. It was coming to understand over the years that it was hanging on to that dumb veracity, the fact of that teacup on the table, but then somehow working out how to suggest the whole world, you know, with that picture, which means it went from being just prescriptive to suggestive. And that's how I learnt to photograph the landscape. It's a funny thing with photography because we don't go to the theatre, you know, for proof of something, well, you do emotional proof, I think, or intuitive intelligence. But we're conditioned to pick up a novel, or we're conditioned to sort of, listen to a piece of music, and we go on a journey of the imagination. With photography, first of all, we're preconditioned to it as proof of something. The evidential authority of the medium precedes any individual reading of a picture. So we've got that, and we've had it for 200 years. So how do you hang on to that and then lightly skip over it so that instead of being a statement, it becomes a question? Because that's the first rung on art's ladder to heaven, whatever that is for each person. And that's how I approach everything now. But I just didn't understand my method. I didn't understand what the substructure was intellectually and emotionally. And the emotional part of it's much more important. Many poets and philosophers have put this better than I ever could, but the last person to put it succinctly was Robert Hughes in Shock of the New, when he said, meaning comes from feeling, not the other way around. If you don't feel anything, it's never going to mean much to you. So here we go, bit of competition. I'll come over here, yes.
Were you aware that 42nd Street was going to be torn down when you were shooting these? Did you have any idea of the plans in place?
And Rudy Giuliani and all the rest of it, yeah.
Did you know about it? Were you trying to capture something that you knew was going to be gone soon?
I knew it was going, yeah. I didn't know that, the tough guy was coming to town and, the whole thing was going to be turned into Disneyland. I didn't have that specific knowledge, but I can feel things slipping away all the time. When I'm photographing someone, if I'm photographing a kid, I can feel their childhood slipping away when I'm photographing them. It's all slipping away. It's like that Victor Hugo thing, It's like life is sort of, roaring backwards into this black chasm all the time, and it speeds up as you learn as you get older. But no, it was just the fact that I was coming to the end of my relationship with the city. I could feel, I could feel that we'd had our relationship to some extent by the time I'd finished this year of work there. And I wasn't thinking specifically about this is all going to go, because everything goes, You could say the same about what's happened to Sydney or Melbourne or any city. Less so some of the European cities perhaps. But it was a bit like, having always loved and been fascinated with art, I could sort of see parallels between, let's say, that and the Weimar Republic. It wasn't on the eve of the Second World War, but you could see how this kind of craziness and this kind of restless, the Germans have a great word, of course, Erwartung. It's halfway between expectation and anxiety. You could see that, you could feel it in the city. And so it was unsustainable. Just the whole life on the streets was unsustainable. And when I used to go and see my friend Peter Sheldale, who was an art critic for the Village Voice and the New Yorker, or before that, the New York Times. Peter's one of the great writers on art in America. They've been very lucky, They've had three great poets in America in the 20th century happened to take an interest in the visual arts: Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, and Peter Sheldale. And when I was first photographing this stuff down there, he lives on St Martin's, East 8th, Lower East Side. And there were just, forget the burnt out cars, there were burnt out buses down that street. And then when we got to know each other, I'd go around to his place, and there'd be like, there were the Volvos and the trees and the streets and everything else. And I said, God, Alphabet City used to be a war zone. And it changed quite quickly. And his wife, Brooke, said to me, Peter's wife, Brooke, said, there's still patches of it. She said, go 2 blocks north. It's all Colombians. They kill everything. Grandmothers, dogs, babies, 2 blocks north. With any conurbation, there are all these different villages, and some of them are rusted on for much longer than other parts. The Times Square being at the centre of that kind of 3rd Avenue, Broadway, crossroads of the world, as they used to call it. Yeah, you could feel it wasn't going to stay like that. And you could feel it when you went into the old Algonquin Hotel. They had a little wooden ticket box in the corner where you could buy tickets to the shows in 42nd Street, and the people that worked there, all this was going to go. So I always had that feeling, it's sort of like a haunted landscape in some respects. But that's, I can see that in a 12-year-old standing in my studio in a so-called controlled environment. There's as much potential in that as there is a standing in a forest with a thunderstorm. You know, it could be anything. You know, it just depends on your imagination. So yes and no, really, but that's how I felt about it. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Congratulations, it's a beautiful series, Bill, thank you. My question is, I suppose a general question with all of your series, but when you're on the other side of that camera, what is it that you're looking for before you hit that button?
I think I'm looking for it for a long time before I even pick up the camera. I think I almost never pick up a camera. I almost never touch a camera. I only pick up a camera when I've got no choice. I mean, I don't want to be like when I have no melodramatic, but I'm saying, you know, when I really need to do it. But until it won't leave me alone, I really need to go and find whatever it is. The camera just sits there, so I might not pick up the camera for a year. You know, I might not even. I'm making pictures in the studio, and then gradually something builds up, and so you already got this tremendous smell in your mind's eye, not even a clear image. There's a sort of an apprehension of significance, but you're not quite sure what it is. So when it clarifies to a certain point, I know what it is. I'm looking for a certain face, or I'm looking for a certain landscape or a mountain or whatever it is. Once it clarifies to a point where I think I know what I want, pick up the camera, and then I go down the end of the street if it's someone I've seen I want to photograph, or to the other side of the world to photograph Roman ruins in Turkey or something, you know. So it has to clarify itself. I've never walked around with a camera. I don't feel like I'm a kind of casual opportunist. You know, I'm walking along, you know, look at that. You know, I mean, we all do it with our phone anyway, but it's very deliberate. And yet at the same time, it's always like, you know, culture is never outside nature. So it's always going to be a step ahead of you anyway. The thing that's pulling you along is always, you know, slipping away from thought. You know, it's disappearing around a bend in the road. You know, and you can smell it. You're not quite sure what it's going to be. And then, you know, you apply yourself and you end up in this landscape or in the presence of this person you want to photograph or whatever it is. And then it goes on another journey. So it's very hard, you know, press the button. It's not so much the button. The button's almost like a kind of it's probably the point at which it goes from the imagination into the physical world, because suddenly you have an image on film. But, you know, it's not so much the button, it's just some kind of line you cross where, how can I put it? I know how to put it. Just talking about art generally. Okay, so if I look at pictures that I've always thought are wonderful, paintings from years ago, and you're standing in front of them, and really, the ones that really had an effect on me, because I've always loved looking at pictures, the really amazing ones, you stand there and you get this gathering sense of disbelief, like, how the hell has someone done this? You know, it's like you're standing in front of Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal in St. Petersburg, or some, you know, late Titian painting in Vienna. I've got all my favourite old friends, I go and see them whenever I'm travelling. Things that really knocked you over, maybe when you were, you know, backpacking and you were 18 or 17, but then you go back and see them 10 years later and like, shit, they're still doing it, you know, they're still doing it, you know. There's one little Rembrandt bridge called a stone bridge in stormy weather, and it's in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and it came to Australia once, it came to the Engineer, it's got this burst of sunlight hitting the bridge. It's a little painting, like a little bit of coloured mud on canvas. And when I first saw it when I was backpacking around, mostly Eastern Europe, and I was taking photographs, but I went there, it was like, wow, look at this. 1637 it was painted. Yeah, the sunlight's still hitting the tree. Wow, you know? That was the feeling. It was like, wow, because it's like, now this picture is actually in the present, as well as being 400 odd years old. And then I'd see it again 10 years later, I'd go, look at that. The sunlight's still hitting the picture. You know, and look, and then you see it as you're getting old. You see it when you're 18, and then you see it when you're in your 60s. You go like, it's still hitting it. 400 years later, and 60 years on top of that, it's still hitting it. You know, you get a gathering sense of disbelief It's like, against the odds, someone has brought this from the world of the imagination into the physical world where you and I can see it, smell it, touch it, against the odds. Because it seems like it's against the odds. It's so unreasonable. It's like listening to some pieces of music and someone's written this down. Not the players are great, but the composers just pulled this out of thin air and it's on paper, where that's the button going click, where musicians can then read the notes and play it. But it's not so much the button, it's that kind of trajectory, the overall trajectory where, you know, when things are going well, the work makes itself. You're just along for the ride. That's how it feels to me. I mean, sure, I'm bringing 50 years of, you know, pretty intense, hopefully virtuosic darkroom, whatever it is, to bear on making a good print. But the thing is, when it's really flying, it's like, you know, you don't know where it's going exactly, but it's making itself, and then it's finished, you know. So the buttons are kind of a funny way of putting it, but I think I would say that line that you cross from having all this in your imagination and then suddenly starting to find a physical form outside your body through which to realise it, that's the button. Sometimes the button part is more important with a click of a camera. Sometimes the photograph really becomes interesting when you've been working in the darkroom with it, and then you start to go, oh, this, I took a photograph of, I thought I was photographing this, but it's actually about this, you know, and that sometimes you find out from making the picture. And sometimes you take the photograph and then it's sitting in the studio with me, they sit around me for years, these pictures, sometimes they're gathering dust piled up everywhere, and you look at it and you just go, it's compelling, I can't let go of it, but there's something wrong with it, and then you realise it's the wrong way up. Sometimes it's really dumb, but it's through the process of working that things are revealed to you, which is why I'm a broken record with all these people that it's fashionable to be managerial with your career now, and I think that it's really important that people try and make their own stuff, because that's where that great intelligence of the body comes into play. You know, you go and talk in schools, kids have great questions. How do you know when something's finished? How do you know what the right size is? The only way you can work that out is to try and make it yourself. Otherwise, some guy in the lab's making all the decisions for you. So that's my long and winding road to the button. Yeah, but there's a tail end.
Quick follow-up, if I may. Something you mentioned there about the sunlight in the paintings that you've seen. To my untrained eye, that sort of study of light, or whatever you call it, is a key feature in your works. Are you looking for that sort of light contrast when you're creating these beautiful images?
Well, that's very kind of you. I don't. I think what you need to do. I think what people are doing, if you more or less successfully, depending on the artist, depending on, you know, the nature of, no one's outside their time or place, so depending on the culture and the place they find themselves in, whatever the medium is, I think the driving thing, if you listen to, you know, I'll talk about things that move me deeply and that I've thought about a lot, and of course it'll be a different bunch of stuff for everyone in the room. But if I think about, you know, Mozart's Magic Flute, or I like classical music, I like a lot of jazz too, but you think about the way there's one live performance of Dave Brubeck with Paul Desmond doing Kyoto Song. There's lots of recordings that have been digitised. That one never was, so it's on an old vinyl record and you can't find it. But it's so limpid. It has this limpid Oriental feel to it. It's quite magical. The only way you can do things like that, the only way you can move a brush up and down and create the sort of, you know, the beauty of this Rembrandt figure, like, you know, Susanna and the Eldest is a study in the National Gallery in London. It's just this girl with a smock just standing in a stream. It's like about 4 brush strokes and it looks like a photograph, you know. The only way you can do things like that is if you're in love. I think the most important thing is actually falling in love. What you need to do is to fall in love. When you go to a fantastic concert, when you walk out of seeing an amazing painting, I think you're falling in love. And I think that that's ultimately what drives it. You know, obviously beauty is the agent. These are very old-fashioned and general terms, but I think that people need to use them more, because the box ticking is, we're drowning in box tickers, you know, people list what their pictures are about now, and there are all these issues, you know, and you hear the language. And some things some people make are great, but the thing is, it's like, you know, I'm going to use my practice to interrogate the following issues, you know, and then they go down the issues of all these issues, you know. I mean, we're drowning in the sea of that. I think if you pull back from it, what really has a lasting impact and a lasting value is something that you fall into. I mean, Glenn Gould, that, you know, great, crazy Canadian pianist, wrote a thing once about falling up. Not falling down, but when you fall in love, you fall up. You know, he had this whole strange essay he wrote about it. And when you listen to him at the end of his life playing the Goldberg Variations, the J.S. Bach piano music, you're like, he can barely do it. He can barely bring it into the world of the audible, but it's quite spellbinding. And great conductors do it. You know, great painters do it. Photographers can do it sometimes. Filmmakers can do it. You know, the only way Tarkovsky, I mentioned earlier, the only way Tarkovsky could have possibly created the end of his film called Nostalgia, I'm trying to sort of keep on that a little bit, where this Russian guy who's finally gets out of, you know, Russia, he's an art historian, he goes to Italy, and he's in Italy and Greece and places, and he dies, has a heart attack. I'm radically oversimplifying it for you, but you can go and watch the film, it's amazing, it's spellbinding. And when he dies, what Tarkovsky does, he sets up this little Russian house, this little old country house that this man grew up in, and there he is lying on the paddock in front of the house. There's a forest behind the house, and there's a pond, and there's his old Alsatian, his dog from when he was a kid, but he's an old man now next to the kid. And then the camera just pulls back, and the whole thing is inside a cathedral in Italy without its roof on. And then it starts to snow, which it doesn't do in Naples, doesn't do. And then you can hear the women in his village singing. And it's so breathtaking. The only way someone can make stuff like that is if they're in love with what they're doing, if they're in love with the subject. There's no other way to, I don't care what people say about, I don't know, critical race theory in relation to my work. I don't care about it. I don't care. What carries art down through the millennia and the centuries is beauty. People fall in love with it. And you can be watching a Hollywood movie, a really good Hollywood film, it doesn't matter what it is, certainly with music. And so I think that's the thing that really is at the crux of the biscuit. I've got a rather glib line I sometimes use when I'm talking to students about it, and I say, look, you know, they're going like, you know what I mean, beauty, like love. And I said, well, yes, beauty is the, you know, the engine of love, you know. The world, you know, the universe runs on attraction, and they're looking at you, the universe runs on, well, you know, if any physicists here, two molecules in a vacuum, all the way up to an episode of Home and Away, it's all about attraction, you know, so it's true, it's true. I mean, it's dumb, but it's not dumb. So I think all of these things are universal things which affect everyone. It's not just about how an artist feels about something, everyone feels this way. And so that's probably what is driving, underneath things, what drives me is I fall in love with what I'm doing, or it falls in love with me, I don't know. So, you know, it's very hard to kind of put this eloquently. It's much better if I just get out, you know, Keats or Browning and read poetry, but, you know, there are some great things that people have said. One of my favourite writers is Elias Canetti, C-A-N-E-T-T-I, won the Nobel Prize, Jewish, got out of Vienna when Freud did, a bit younger than Sigmund Freud. And had an affair. Canetti, the only social bit of stuff about him is he had an affair with Iris Murdoch, if any of you read her work. But he wrote what is considered by many of the great literary critics, the Harold Blooms and the various people around the world that have been, you know, good cultural critics over the years, John Berger. He wrote what they call the great book on madness in the 20th century called Auto de Fe. And he wrote another book called Crowds and Power, which is also quite incredible. But he kept these day books where he just jot things down. You know, he just jot stuff down as he went along. Kept them for decades. And he was in London during the Blitz, and he wrote this thing about, you know, so, you know, flying used to be fun. You know, like we're all being bombed. You know. He'd put these little poetic things down. And he said something about distance and the difference between intimacy and mere familiarity. That's another very important thing with me. You've got to figure out with photography how you can do something which is profoundly intimate, if possible, because when you're lying on your carpet at night listening to your favourite piece of music, it's an intensely intimate experience, but it's not at all familiar, you know. And for photography to be not merely familiar, oh, there we are, like a selfie, you know, there it is, that's that. But intimate is another level of operating altogether. And Canetti made this, and that's central to the whether a picture works or doesn't work for me. You know, if I feel intimacy can compromise the subject, familiarity can compromise the subject, but intimacy, you know, can actually leave the subject completely mysterious. And you know, there are 100 smart things that people have said over. I mean, it's Einstein. Einstein said mystery is the most beautiful thing in the world. You know, that's what you want to do. You want to make the world strange again, and you do that with intense intimacy, but not familiarity. So those things about regulating the perceived or the felt distance is very important. Canetti says a few things. 1969, Apollo landing on the moon. He has a couple of funny things to say first. He says, so disappointing. Everything we calculated about the moon, size, weight, distance from Earth, is correct. You know, there goes the magic of the moon. And then he sort of has a political thought. He says, you know, what are they actually doing up there? Secrets deposited on the moon. You know, so he's a scholar, but he's very poetic. And then he said, if we discovered a hitherto unknown tribe in the South American jungle, maybe the best way to document them would be from the moon, because perhaps only that distance might give us the respect we need to realise that it's something that will be unfathomable. And you know, so he talks about things like this. All of this stuff applies when you make objects, whether it's sculpture, whether it's photographs, whether it's painting. It's really important, all this sort of stuff. And it's a kind of, I know I'm the master of the subordinate clause. It goes all over the place, but I hope I'm making some sense. This is the engine of it. So, gee, you got a long answer there, didn't you? There's one at the back. Can you just speak up?
Yeah. You mentioned that the Glenn Mobley photos were dreamscapes.
Yeah.
Could it be argued that oil photos are dreamscapes? I mean, when I look at the Egyptian archways or the audience members in the opera or anything from your career, I feel a real evocative, ethereal, dream-like feeling. I'm never looking at an audience member. I'm thinking about something else when I'm seeing it. Could it happen they're all dreamscapes?
Well, at one level, certainly, because with that particular, examples are the easiest way really to sort of approach this verbally for me anyway. So with the Paris Opera series, the commission I got from those people, I worked out pretty quickly. I mean, you can do anything you like. You know, you can do sets, you can design costumes, you can document a performance, you can, do portraits, blah, 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 blah. And they had a fantastic program of inviting visual artists. And I remember when I was there doing my work, Richard Serra was in the belfry of the Garnier Opera carving all these giant styrofoam angels out of blocks of styrofoam. They've had some interesting, Cy Twombly had done some great squims. They had a lot of interesting people go through there. I decided, possibly predictably in light of my earlier work, that I was absolutely wanted to photograph the audience all gathered in the darkness awaiting some special event. That's what really fascinated me, and the light reflected onto them from the stage. But really, what were you photographing? Because it's not about portraiture. If anything, it'd be anti-portraiture. It's not like I was trying to really show you what, Jenny looked like, or, introduce you to an individual. It's an anti-portrait. They all are. And so what you were dealing with was just humanity and just the human condition and this sense of, this communal sense of all being gathered together in this special place awaiting some event. And so that sense of expectation, all of the things that we all feel at different times, but also with that communal sense of there being something that brings us together. So that's how I approached that. And that's the feeling I wanted to give it, as though people were spellbound, if you like, or waiting to be spellbound, or a bit like that great French painter Watteau, all this there's a number of variations on this. Embarkation for Cythera painting is a great one in the Louvre. You know, all these people are all dressed up and, you know, they're 1870s, and they're all getting onto this boat, and it's going to go somewhere. It's going to go to Ithaca, it's going to go to the mystical island, you know. So that sort of very much would have been my take. I'm not interested in... See, I got that wrong when I started working on it. Well, I didn't get it wrong, I just hadn't worked out exactly... I hadn't got enough of a handle on it. So the first photographs I was doing there all were technically fine, but they looked like a document. They felt like a document of some other event, which was going to be the performance, right? Or the crowd gathered there. I wanted the photographs to be the main event, not to be a document of some other event. And to do that, I realised I needed to make them less real, more wooden, more artificial. And here I'll draw on a great interview that Melvin Bragg did, one of the greatest interviews with a visual artist ever, with Francis Bacon, where he's talking to Francis Bacon. It's on YouTube, and he's saying that Francis, these figures are, you know, they're distorted, and in one respect they're compelling, but they're not real. And he said, well, art is artifice, you know. And so it is about making the world strange again, if you will, you know.
In doing so, you've captured something perhaps bigger. You've got more information coming at the viewer.
Yeah, and you have those landscapes too. And the landscapes, it's like the juxtaposition is sort of going, you know, is this what these people are seeing in their mind's eye? I don't know, but they became a necessary component. So that's what they were. That's where they went, you know. Yeah. Yes. I might put that over there. Yeah.
So when you mentioned before about wanting to avoid this is what Jenny looked like, when you go to photograph a person, what do you think is the difference between photographing a person and it's particularly about them, or when they come to stand in for an idea like existence or humanity?
Right. Okay. Well, I think naturally you want both. You want both. It is going to be a particular person because, well, I mean, if it's in focus and you can see them, and you can certainly, with my models, you can see very clearly. You can see the skin, you can see the texture, you can see the physiology or the physiognomy of the face. So clearly it's about hanging on to that thing that I said before, the prescriptive nature of the medium, you know, the mapping of a body in space or a face. But you've got to I think the reason I stopped painting, I got into art school with a painting folio and I loved it and I never thought I'd ever do anything else. All I did as a kid is paint and draw. But I think what gradually drew me in was that although no medium's more or less intrinsically limited than any other medium, of course it's what a person does with it, whatever the medium, there is something unique about photography, and I think it is the most profoundly contradictory of mediums. Because of that, there it is, proof that you've got to, there it is, there's no way around it. I mean, we're conditioned to see it that way. But how do you skip over that completely? So you want to have all of that tender, breathing, proximate, tender actuality, intimacy of a person in front of the camera. But at the same time, you want it to be completely mysterious. Or I like to say, what I really want is I want the gravity of that, I don't know, 10-year-old boy turning his head sideways. I want to hang on to all of that intimacy and that unique sensibility and that kind of breathing presence. But at exactly the same time, I want it to feel like you're looking at the pyramids, the ancient pyramids, like millennially distant, absolutely unknowable. So I don't know how often you could, it's possible. You've got to believe it's possible to do that. Get both of those things happening at once in a photograph. And so you do hang on to the detail, but what overtakes the detail is something that universalises the subject and actually takes you into the world of abstract things, such as, you know, beauty and love and all of those sorts of things. I mean, that's how I see it. But it's a high wire act. And if you get it wrong, it's immediately obvious in photography because of that evidential authority. It's like, you know, it's like you're too close. Or the way you know it's wrong is if you feel it, as though it compromises the subject, as though there's some sense that you might know something about a person, even though they're standing there. Maybe they're naked, they're standing there. If they can remain unknowable, it works. So they remain inviolate. You know, you can't get to them. You can never know anything about them. Sure, you know, they've got brown hair or whatever, but it doesn't take you anywhere. So it's a balancing act, it's a high wire act. And you're always trying to... I remember in Gustav Mahler's widow wrote a book of... she had a book of letters. Donald Mitchell edited them. And there's a great quote from one of his letters where he's explaining to someone, I think it was Bruno Volta, who was a young conductor, a young understudy when Mahler was composing. Mahler died in 1911. So, where he says, you know, when you write a symphony, you want to get the whole world in. Mm. And so a young Bruno Volta comes to see Mahler somewhere up in, where was it? It might have been on the Vertice, it might have been Carinthia, I'm not sure, but there are mountains. And he gets off a boat coming across the lake, and Mahler's rented a house there. And he goes, Bruno goes, wow, look at those mountains. He said, you don't need to look at them anymore, I've got them in the music, you know, sort of thing. So, you know, it's about trying to get the whole world in. And so even though you might just have some poor innocent child in front of the camera, you know, you have to universalise that subject, which makes them ultimately unknowable and mysterious, which makes something far more beautiful in the way that Einstein suggested. Mystery is the most beautiful thing. And at the same time, you've actually got information. So you've got these two, I would say almost seemingly opposing forces held in some kind of magical vibrating suspension. And that's when things really start to work. And that's the case when I listen to music, when I go and look at paintings that I like. It's when I pick up, a book of poetry, you know, I don't know, early 20th century Greek Alexandrian poet, Cavafy. Oh God, he's written some great poems. And he wrote a poem about Ithaca, the journey to the island. You know, don't expect riches when you get to the end of your journey. The island gave you the journey. You know, it's a beautifully written poem. He's sitting in a cafe and he's sort of staring at a coffee and he goes, you know, so somehow slips this little tiny line into a little poem. It's like, oh, how the hours have gone by, you know, how the years have gone by, you know, but the way he does it, it's like, whoa, it's like falling upwards, you know, it's really good. So it's in every medium, it's just how you approach it and what you're able to do. So, no hecklers. So I hope I'm being coherent.
You speak of mystery and imagination, and I see that in the darkness, certainly in the darkness of your painting or your works, and with the advent of LED lighting, I call it a scourge, and even digital, that everything's overlit. That the profound difference with these images and the landscape of the globe really is there's very little darkness I mean, just to elaborate, when Tarantino shot Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, he said, unless I shoot it now, this film can never be made. Mm. And the cinematographer spoke of like the overlighting of the city. Yep,
sure. Well, look, that's part of what we spoke about earlier with these things. You know, the light sources change. But if you've got enough money, you know, you can I mean, they're still making film. You know, Eastman colour neg film's still being made, and my neg film, which is a Kodak portrait, I've shot neg film only my entire life. That's still being made, and it's a really simple process. And as long as you have, you know, accurate C41 process for it, or the Eastman colour process, you can keep shooting film. But the thing about shooting film, unlike digital, is you need to light everything because, you know, otherwise the film won't pick it up. Film is so slow. It's so lacking in light sensitivity to, you know, modern chips in digital. You can point, you know, like, you know, everyone knows you pick your phone up, take a picture in the dark, you can see it, you know, it's like incredible. Take a picture here, you can see everything. But if you just got out a film camera and just went snap, you know, you could use super fast film and a super fast lens and you might get something. But with film, you really have to light it. So you have to kind of create what you want to see of the things and the objects and the people that are in front of the camera. And so what it does is it brings in a whole other level of concentration. So to your point, I don't think that it's necessary. You can do anything with digital technology. The number crunching is so big. If you want to, you can push back against the thing on the phone that clicks it and makes it sharper every time you go take a picture and it brightens it up for you and all this nonsense. There's lots of boffins trying to write something that gets around that for the iPhone 13 at the moment, and 14. But what's more important though about it is that when you shoot with film, you don't get to see the results straight away. You've got to wait until the film gets processed. And so the relationship you have with the subject is totally different. Instead of like, yeah, do it again, you've got some model of, or some person or someone, no, look at the back of the laptop, it plugged into your thing, or the back of your camera, no, do it again, no, do it again, no, that's good, no, do it again. It's just all quick decisions. And it's also decisions which are being verified by the technology. So what that does is that winds back what I would consider your intuitive intelligence, the wisdom of your body going, feeling things, a bit like the thing that kids are losing, which is that, their body tells them when they're in danger before their brain even has the idea. It's like, just get the hell out of here. That's the body. That's the intelligence of the body. That applies when you're making pictures too. You have to kind of know, you have to kind of feel what you're doing without being able to kind of check and see whether the back of the camera's got it. Because if you do that, you have the level of concentration is of an entirely different order. Let's say you go to Turkey to photograph Roman ruins in Ephesus. You fly all the way there and you go there and you've got a whole lot of film. Then you've got to get the film processed in London before you can even see the negs. So when you're clambering around this, very expensive idea you've got for a photograph, you're really, really much more involved in what you're seeing, what you actually are seeing. Ways of seeing, as John Berger put it. You're seeing a hell of a lot more because you're really looking, because you can't just check the result straight away. And that changes the relationship with the subject, whether it's a thunderstorm in a forest or whether it's working with a person in a studio, so-called controlled environment. I don't think of it that way at all. Anything can happen, They can make a gesture which completely changes your whole idea about what you're doing just by moving their head or hand. So it's not really any more controlled than a forest with a thunderstorm in it. But the thing is, you then begin to rely much more upon that sense of sensitivity and sensibility of what's happening between you and the subject. Whereas with digital, you're more inclined to just, defer to the technology. It keeps breaking the level of concentration. It keeps breaking that long-term thing. When I work with my models, which I do for years, you get to a point where, because it's deeply, deeply politically incorrect, which I love so much, the idea of the artist and the muse, because everyone's bashing Picasso, bashing everyone at the moment. But really what the muse is about is, if you're Ansel Adams, your muse was Yosemite National Park. Your muse is Half Dome. Your muse is the American wilderness. It depends on where your centre of gravity is on that particular subject area. But if your muse is a person, it's essentially the same thing. Perhaps the difference is that you are able to record in a more immediate way or sense the conversation that you're having, because it's two human beings working in space. So what happens there? They realise once they've done something, and they realise that they've done something and you've realised it, and it's like, oh, that was it. That's just a turn or something, or someone's done something with their eyes, and you both get it. It's something that's powerfully apprehended but not fully understood is how I describe it. But you both get it. So it makes you much more sensitive to the subject, whatever the subject might be. Whereas digital, I think, tends to work against that. And that's why I still shoot film. I don't shoot film, it's inconvenient. It's all kinds of things, but I still shoot film. But it also, film does make you have to create what's in front of the camera. You have to use lighting. You have to do all kinds of things. What do I want this to be? How should it look? How should the light fall on the body or the face? What am I going to do here in this forest? You have to think a lot more about it. With digital technology now, bang, you've just got it. Sure, you can go home and you can scan it in and you can spend weeks doing wonderful things to it, but the relationship with the subject will be different. And I've got an actress, acquaintance, friend, mate, whatever, who's sitting on, she once said, oh, can you do a portrait of me? And I said, as a favour. I said, oh, yeah, sure. So some film she was in, and I pulled out my camera and I said, oh God, you're still shooting on film? And I said, yeah. And then I explained what I've just said now. And then she said to me, she said, yeah, I get that. She said, I'm sitting on a set in Hollywood Hair and makeup just walk through, no one gives a stuff, and it's because it's just a hard drive going around. It's not costing anything. And I said to imagine if you were working on a film for Visconti or Flynn and the budget allowed for 3 takes of film and then you were out of money. The level of concentration on the set would be massive compared to this. And she got it, you know, so that's my thing about digital and film. They're important differences, but they're not about the ability to pick up detail, they're not about that, they're about the relationship with the subject. Did that make sense? Yeah, okay. Okay, well you've had it. Is there anyone else desperate for a question? No, you're the desperate guy. There you are.
You brought up film being slow, so it's your fault, not mine. But would you mind telling us a little bit about what film speeds you were engaging with,
Oh, sure.
in this series?
Sure, well, the business of, you know, photographing this landscape at night, obviously the biggest amount of light, ambient light in New York City 35 years ago was Times Square and around top 42nd Street and, you know, West 44 and intersections and whatever, 5th and 6th and all that area there. So that made it possible, but it was also the crossroads of the city anyway. So the whole nature of the demographic, the whole nature of the natives and the tourists and everything moved through that area. So it was very, very dynamic and interesting, along with all the sleaze and craziness as well. So to do that, and I decided I was going to shoot this on a telephoto lens, and telephoto longer lenses are much slower than shorter lenses. You know, even back then you could get a standard lens which was f/0.9, so a really fast lens. But I wanted the long lens. I wanted that feeling of a flattening feeling of different. Well, I wanted a narrow plane of focus in a sea of detail. You know, things behind out of focus, things in front out of focus, but certain planes of focus that pick out certain details. And of course, you get a much shallower depth of field with a telephoto lens. And so that, but because they're much slower, being a longer lens, smaller apertures, more light, more lens and glass for the light to pass through, etc. More light being bent into the lens. That means you had to have as big aperture as you could, and it means that also reduced the focal plane, or the focal depth, and you needed to use slow shutter speeds, or to a point. What did I want clear? What did I want blurring as someone walked, or did I want to, you know, all that stuff is just there to think through and work out. And I'd been shooting stuff with a 6x7 camera, which is even slower, from a chopper the time before this when I was there. We're going around the Twin Towers and up and down 3rd Avenue and stuff off the end of Manhattan. So, you know, you had to balance the time of day. So when daylight was going down and the city lights were coming up, but there was still enough ambient light to catch it on film. You don't have to do any of that now. You just get your digital camera out and go for it. So all of those things, though, you think about the short so-called limitations of the medium, they are the gift. They are the gift, you know, because you have to you leave things out. It's an editing process. And people sometimes say, well, there's always a lot of shadows in your pictures and black. Why? And I say, well, you know, sometimes it's what goes missing in the shadows that animates the speculative capacity. What's going on here? I can't say, you know, who are these people? Where is this place? And that question is the thing. You know, the guy that started the National Gallery in Canberra, James Mollison, who was a fabulous guy and genius, once said, of course, you know, he said, how did he put it? I've got to think exactly what he said. Something about, yes, animating the speculative. Yes, he said it's very important about, you know, what's left out, you know, and what's left in, you know, make or break a great picture. And I think that's how he put it. And sort of I knew that, but he was looking at some stuff of mine I was a student, he'd sought me out in some student household years ago. But I remember thinking, that's right, it's there to be modulated. So things that you want to be more prominent, you can make more prominent. Others can be pushed back. But using a lens with a shallow depth of field and having to kind of move, if you want to move, there's one somewhere, there's a fire truck over there, and do you want the fire truck sharp or do you want the rest of the landscape sharp? You can't have both because the fire truck's cutting through it, you know, and you're on 30th of a second or something quite slow. And I decided then I wanted the landscape all to be slightly fractioned blurred, and I tracked with the light truck, which means I can see the driver's profile and I can see the guy with his moustache hanging out the window. You know, it's like you have to decide what you want as it's happening, and it's all just there to be used. It's all just there to be used. So anyway, that's it.